This is the first of, I don't know how many events the university is putting on over COP26, and it's great to start today, given that the Conference of the Parties across the way in Glasgow has begun. And in a way, the session tonight is looking at what do ordinary people in different countries around the world, that, Ipsos MORI, one of the biggest survey companies in the world did, and I think the report that we'll get the presentation on tonight was released in August. So the same month that IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, came out, and that was Code Red for Humanity. This is the Antonio Guterres UN General Secretary. But I think in comparison to what is going on in Glasgow, even though there's going to be lots of activist orientation, the presentation tonight is really taking the temperature of ordinary citizens around the world. And I certainly think that if you haven't read this report, and I think I flagged this up with my students, a month or so ago, to get them to go and read this, because it's really important in terms of sense checking, either that citizens are leery and they're reticent about climate action. That's often used by some politicians as an excuse not to go quicker and further. Or is it that there's a greater appetite amongst our citizens for more aggressive and ambitious action? Although, as I'm sure our colleagues tonight will point out, there does seem to be a sense in which citizens around the world, seem to be, confused is the wrong word, but there seems to be a lack of understanding of the extent of the changes that may be required. Well, not maybe, that will be required if we are to keep global heating below 1.5. And before I pass over to my colleagues, the reason for that is that we are facing a planetary emergency that is partly can be explained by COVID. I mean, people seem to think that, and I have done myself, there are lessons from how states and citizens have responded to COVID, and we can learn some of those. But actually, COVID itself is not a separate crisis to the climate and ecological one, but is an essential part of it. In terms of biodiversity loss in many parts of the world, now releasing pathogens and viruses that human beings haven't really come up into contact with. In other words, wilderness areas are not just pretty, they're not just repositories of ecosystem diversity and ways of storing carbon. They've actually sequestered some deadly bugs and viruses from humanity. And therefore, the more we start encroaching on these as a result of ecological expansion, the more likely it is that these types of pandemics will become more frequent. So again, my own view is the pandemic is not a separate crisis. It's just another example of human beings essentially degrading more and more of the life-supporting systems of the planet and calling it progress. And it just seems to me that we're now at this crunch time where nobody is officially a climate denier. We were just talking about this before people came in. But it seems to be now that climate delay is the new climate denial. So we accept the science and the reality, but whether or not we accept how quickly and the extent to which we have to change is a moot issue. And that has to do, for me, with a whole complex of issues that our colleagues will talk about. But one, just to flag up, is the energy transition. I think people misunderstand and they underestimate that once you change the energy system of any society and economy, almost everything else changes. So, for example, the transition away from fossil fuels, coal, oil and gas, and the movement towards low carbon and renewable forms of energy will inevitably lead to the electrification of almost everything in our lives. How we transport ourselves, how obviously we heat our homes, our lighting, that the electrification of our lives is, I think, an underappreciated part of the transition. It has all sorts of interesting innovation, and how does that connect down with the food system, the transportation system, including, I think, a really exciting area of the integration of information communications technology, real-time data analytics in that energy transition. So for me, just to finish, I mean, this is an exciting time to be alive. It's pretty scary at times, but part of the hope that we need to generate is to be realistic about where people are at, but also the science is pretty clear. You know, if we keep on a path to where we're going, and this is the UN emissions gap report that they come out with quite nicely just in advance of COP. If what states are currently committed to reducing, and we've had the dreadful news just in the last couple of hours of India, Narendra Modi, the president of the Prime Minister of India, has said India will commit to net zero by 2070. And that's a full 20 years after what the Composite of the Parties is aiming for. You know, China has said 2060. So there are serious discrepancies. And you could say, well, that's partly to do with these countries still develop and so on. But it does seem to me that we're at a unique point in human history where the science is ever more compelling. I mean, sometimes I think we could be the first species ever to accurately document our own demise. It's not as if, in a way, we need necessarily any more science, because the science has been pretty clear for quite some time. But it's that moment of truth that we're now at. It's like that phrase, if you know, the wonderful African-American novelist and thinker James Baldwin, who said, not everything that is faced can be overcome, but nothing can be overcome until it's faced. And I think that's the issue we're up now against, the moment of truth in terms of how far and how quickly we're willing to go. And with that, I'd like to hand over to my colleagues here from Ipsos MORI. We have Sophie Thompson, who's in the middle, who is a former student of this place and an alumni, and she's joined by our colleague Bridget Williams, and then we have Fiona in Glenavy. So I don't know who's going to kick off. Is it yourself, Bridget? Yeah. Thanks very much, and you're very welcome.
Thanks very much for that introduction. I quite happily just listen to you chatting for a while, John, rather than us starting. So I hope we're not a disappointment. We were really delighted to be asked by the Global Commons Alliance to work on this interesting, really important study. They came to us at a pretty early stage in their thinking, so it was great to work with them to kind of really refine some of the topics and some of the methods that we used. So as far as we're aware, this is the first time these issues have been examined on a large scale with this particular focus and in this detail and across the G20. So I'm hoping now my slides will move. There we go. We're also really happy to have been invited to talk to you tonight about the project, because I mean, we're beavering away, well, at the moment in our houses, but usually in the office in London. And you don't always remember that it can have broader interest and consideration. So it's really good to hear that people are finding our work interesting. So just before I start to talk about the survey, I want to say a little bit about Ipsos MORI and who we are. You possibly hear about us in relation to political polling, but we do actually have a very large and well-regarded energy and environment team, of which Sophie and I are members. We run a lot of research and broader evaluations looking at energy and environment in the round. So this looks at things like impacts across people's lives. We evaluate government policies and we work very closely with them to learn from what's gone before and to feed into future policy development. We also aim to advance understanding of environmental issues in the UK and around the world. So Sophie and I work in public affairs, so we only work for government, arm's length bodies, charities, university sector and NGOs. We also have a big sustainability practice which works with commercial companies across a number of different sectors. So we're currently working in FMCG, automotive, healthcare, financial services and across the service sector as well. Really important to our work is delivering impact. So what we don't want to be is a big old data factory. Instead, we want to affect some real change through delivering impactful, actionable work and making sure these insights are available to drive broader changes through the population. And I think that's why we're really, really happy to talk at events like this one. So Sophie and I both work out of our London office, but as you can see, we're in our own houses right now. We do have a network of offices around the UK, including an office in Belfast, and we've got a lot of links with Belfast. So our UK CEO, as announced this morning, is from Belfast. Sophie's from near Belfast. I said she was from Belfast earlier and she told me off. I'm quite a frequent visitor too, so I spent a lot of time on the North Antrim coast. Also joining us on the call is Fiona Rooney from our Belfast office, who leads a team looking at lots of really interesting issues. Do you want to say a few words about that, Fiona?
Yes, thank you, Bridget. As Bridget said, I'm Fiona Rooney, and I look after the Ipsos MORI business in Northern Ireland. We have, although we're part of public affairs, we work across both public and private clients here in Northern Ireland. And some of the really interesting work that we've done over the last year, for example, we did a fairly large scale ethnographic and qualitative research piece on renewable and sustainable living in Northern Ireland. So finding out what people actually do in terms of electric cars, solar panels on their roof, or different forms of heating. We've also helped one of our private sector financial clients to develop their green mortgage offering, and have conducted some research for them in order to do that. I suppose one of the really interesting pieces that we've done is also working with some of the utility companies in order to feed into their own environmental plans and their environmental strategies. So through large scale deliberative events, asking their customers and the whole of the Northern Ireland public about how they're aware, what they're aware of in terms of climate change and sustainability, what they're doing, what impact, as Bridget said, it's all about impact, but what impact that they can make as individuals within Northern Ireland, and looking at some of the alternatives that we could possibly introduce. And of course, with our new environmental policies making their way through the Assembly at the minute, it's never been more interesting than doing work in this area. So I'm going to hand back to Bridget now to continue on with the results from this research.
Fantastic, thanks Fiona. So on to the study in hand. It obviously feels really salient at the moment with COP26 going on in Glasgow. Just worth bearing in mind the timing of the study. So this was completed in April and May this year. Obviously things are going to have moved on a little since the fieldwork was completed. But if we're as expected, everything has moved up a little bit, it's even more heartening as long as everybody can kind of maintain the momentum that there does seem to be out there at the moment. So the study was commissioned by the Global Commons Alliance. It's a group of academics, researchers and writers from over 50 organisations around the world. And they're working to create a powerful network to scale science-based action to protect people and planet. So they are looking to empower ordinary citizens, cities and local areas, companies and whole countries to become stewards of the global commons. And I'll come on to talk about what the global commons means in this context in just a moment. So our particular survey aimed to better understand attitudes to planetary stewardship and whether people really understood the challenges to protecting and restoring nature globally. So we wanted to know where they felt the responsibility lay. Did they really understand the actions that need to be taken and how these do actually amount to sweeping societal changes? And if these changes are to be made, to what extent do citizens around the G20 support them? So how we actually did this, we conducted an online survey of adults aged 16 to 75 across the G20. So it was around 1,000 in each country, 19,735 people across the G20 in total. As I mentioned, fieldwork was conducted in April and May, and the data we're going to show you today covers the G20 countries only. We did include Sweden as well. They had a particular interest in Sweden. So if anybody wants to have a look at a Sweden only data set, we've got one of those knocking about too. Before we start looking at the data, it's worth a quick stop to consider some of the important terminology. And we're actually trying to take the public along with us in looking at some fairly complex concepts. So we did have to simplify things quite a lot to make sure that our participants felt able to answer, and actually they were answering the questions we thought they were answering. So within the survey and through this presentation, we used the terms global commons and nature kind of interchangeably. There were a number of points through the survey. We did define and remind our participants about exactly what this meant. So this is the definition that we use. So it includes life on Earth, fresh air and climate, oceans, forests, ice sheets, fresh water, and other processes that keep the Earth stable and resilient. Before we get into detail, I'm just going to show you a few headlines from the data. So firstly, looking at perceptions of nature and climate. And our participants did express clear concerns about the state of the global commons. So we had 6 in 10, that's 58%, saying that they're extremely or very worried about it. There was also acknowledgement that the Earth is close to tipping points because of human activity, so around 3/4 agreed that this is the case. And there is a lot of desire to take action. So 7 in 10 said they believe the benefits of action outweigh the costs, and over 4/5 said that they personally wanted to do more to protect and restore nature. There definitely appears to be broad desire to move beyond wealth and profit as measures of countries' health, and this is towards more well-being economies which prioritise the health and well-being of people and of nature. And I think that's quite a big jump that people are kind of moving with us now to make in terms of how they view their countries. Moves on to the question of whether people do actually understand the types of changes needed to protect the global commons, and I think the answer to that is not really at present. We had less than 1 in 10 who were aware that big societal changes are needed to safeguard the global commons. They could answer about transformations in energy production and use, that was fairly well known, but awareness of other broader transformations was much lower. And when we asked people to what stops them from taking more individual action to protect the global commons, it was affordability that was the main barrier. They said that they just didn't have the money to do it. Lack of information also came through really strongly as a reason, and there were very mixed views on whether current media communications do actually support people to take action. Finally, to what extent might the COVID pandemic that was still very much ongoing around the world at the time of the fieldwork, to what extent might that provide opportunities for societal change? I think the view was that it's opening the door. So the nature of global interconnectedness has become more apparent as a result of the pandemic. So we had 7 in 10 said they're now more aware of how interconnected societies are. The pandemic also highlighted that people can change their behaviour rapidly. And we had 7 in 10, so 71% across the G20 agreeing that post-pandemic recovery provides an opportunity to transform societies to be able to better deal with future shocks like pandemics and other extreme events. Through the research, we looked in quite a lot of detail as to who Global Commons Alliance and other people working in this field need to engage, and who are the advocates, so who is already moving on this attitudinal and understanding journey with them. So advocates definitely include women, younger people, families, higher earners, and those with higher levels of education, so degree or above. We also found strong links between the sorts of attitudes that we were looking for through the survey, with people who have a global rather than a national outlook, and those expressing pro-environmental attitudes also appear to be more engaged with the issues and supportive of the changes needed. In terms of who needs to be brought along, really it's the opposite. So it's men, older people, people with lower levels of education, and those with a national rather than a global outlook. So that provides a bit of an overview of the data set as we launch into the data in a little bit more detail and see what it's telling us. So firstly, is the world aware of the risks to the global commons? I think broadly, yes is the answer. And what I'm showing you here is the results of some other Ipsos MORI polling looking at the broader issues that people are concerned about. So this was asked of adults in 28 countries in September this year. And it was an open, unprompted question. So we just asked people from the top of their own heads, what are the main issues that worry them? At the time the data was collected, the COVID pandemic was the most worrisome issue. 36% said that that was worrying them, and that was followed by unemployment, poverty and social inequality. But we also had climate change up there in the top 10 issues. So 16% said without prompting that it was a worry. Turning to our survey, across the G20, we had 3/5, 58%, saying they are extremely or very worried about the state of nature today. And we had 61% who said they were worried about the state in which we will leave nature for future generations. Worry about the state in which we'll leave nature for future generations is higher amongst those who may have more of a stake. So it was amongst women, people of sort of childbearing age, so 25 to 34s, and families with children. And there were also links with education, with people who are educated to degree level or higher, more likely to be worried. And linking back to some of the things that John was saying before we started speaking, it's also notable that people in the global south, and generally in countries who could be described as slightly more close to nature, like sort of biodiverse Brazil and Indonesia and India, which frequently experiences extreme climate events, they were all more likely to express worry. We also saw similar differences between countries when we asked people whether they agreed that because of human activities, the Earth is close to tipping points in nature, where climate or nature may change suddenly or may be more difficult to stabilise in the future. So across the G20 as a whole, we have 73% agreeing with this, but levels of agreement were again higher in those countries that I mentioned earlier. So it was 9 in 10 in Indonesia, it was 83% in Brazil, and agreement was lower in more developed Western economies. So it was down to 65% in the UK, 66% in Canada. And while it's heartening to see that levels are over the 2/3 mark in all countries, it's also disappointing to see that around 1 in 10 across the G20 disagrees that this is the case. And we see just the same geographical divide when looking at other kind of elements and other constructs of kind of environmental concern. So people in Brazil, Indonesia and India are all more likely to agree with these statements that I'm showing you now. So the issue is seen as more mid-term than short-term at this point. So 6 in 10 agreed that nature is already too damaged to continue meeting humans' needs in the long term. But we had fewer, so it's around half, agreeing that nature can meet the needs of humans right now. We only had 3 in 10 agreeing and half disagreeing that if people carry on as we are, nature will still be able to meet the needs of humans in the future. I will say we've done some further polling in the last month or so, which has indicated that the time horizons have become closer for people, and they are now seeing this as a more immediate issue than they were even back in April and May of this year. All of this can be a bit of a rallying call. So we had 69%, 7 in 10 agreeing that the benefits of taking action to protect nature are greater than any costs. And while again levels of agreement were higher in Brazil, Indonesia and India, it's heartening to see that on the whole 2/3 or more from most of the G20 countries agreed. So the only exceptions we had here were France and Japan. Leads to the question of personal action. So do people actually want to be better planetary stewards? Generally, yes. When we talk to the sort of man or woman on the street, the vast majority across the G20 said they wanted to do more to protect and restore nature in the future. It was again the same countries that I keep mentioning, Indonesia, Brazil, and this time joined by South Africa and Mexico, who were more likely to say that they wanted to do that. And once again, levels were lower amongst the developed countries like Europe, North America and Japan. Within each country, it was the same groups that I mentioned at the start who wanted to do more as well. So women, younger people, families with children, higher income, better educated, and also those who felt like a global citizen, who understand global interconnectedness and hold broader sort of pro-environmental attitudes. It's good to see that lots of people want to do more in the future, but why aren't they doing more right now? As I mentioned in the summary, the main barrier was financial, so 36% said that they don't have enough money to do more across all of the G20, and this was the top ranked barrier across almost all countries. So that included rich countries and poor countries. Other barriers include lack of information, and I'll come back to this in just a second, lack of facilities, and the fact that they just haven't got around to it at the moment. So 23% said they haven't prioritised this up until now, but they're planning to in the future. So the only country for which financial barriers were most commonly mentioned was France, where lack of facilities was perceived to be a stronger barrier. And lack of facilities was also mentioned as a strong barrier to action in places like India, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Russia. And lack of information was perceived as a particular barrier in Japan, Russia, and France. So I'm going to hand over to talk for Sophie, who's going to talk about awareness of the scale of transformation that's required.
Great, thanks very much, Bridget. So yes, Bridget's kindly taken us through awareness of the threat to the global commons and whether people are willing to become planetary stewards, but are they also aware of the need to change how we run and organise our societies in order to protect and restore nature? So at Ipsos MORI, we've been researching this for some time now. So we do an annual Earth Day poll, which we ran again in 2021. As well as a client-focused Perils of Perception survey, which ran across 30 markets worldwide to measure just how aware people are of what they should be doing in relation to climate change and just how far they're actually willing to go. So what did we find out? Well, aligning with the Global Commons survey findings, 7 in 10 agreed that if people do not act now to combat climate change, they will be failing future generations. And we also saw that the public across these 30 markets felt that they were more likely to take climate action over the next 12 months when we asked them back in March. However, as you can see on this slide, lower impact, although of course still very important actions such as avoiding plastic packaging and buying less stuff top the chart, while higher impact actions such as adopting a plant-based diet and flying less come much further down. And this suggests more could be done to encourage people to take up other behaviours by increasing their understanding of their environmental impacts. And before I move on, it's also worth noting that when we compare results from the markets that were surveyed in 2021 with those that we surveyed in February 2020, there's little change on sustainable behaviours since before the COVID-19 pandemic became more widespread. However, as a bit of a glimmer of hope, the bigger upticks that we do see are in those higher impact areas. So, for example, likelihood to fly less was up by 4 points in 2021 compared to 2020, and reducing dairy consumption was up 3 points. So we have more people intending to take these actions little by little. Our next slide looks at some of our Perils of Perception data, which just highlights that point even further. So while the public believe they know what to do to tackle climate change, with 69% saying they know what action they need to take, it's these higher impact climate actions that are consistently at the bottom of their list. So you can see in this slide that people are consistently overestimating the efficacy of lower impact actions such as recycling in this case and installing low energy light bulbs, while at the same time they underestimated the efficacy of some of the highest impact actions such as flying less, not having a car, and more sensitive topics like having one less child in their family. And the next slide is the exact same data, just flipped about again. So it shows the actions ranked by their actual carbon impact. And while at least people are being consistent in their misunderstanding of what it is we should be doing, it is concerning for galvanising effective action. And we call this discrepancy between what people believe versus what is actually true about climate change the believed true gap. So within this context of desire to act, but lack of understanding as to how, this study for the Global Commons Alliance shows that awareness of a need for major societal change across the G20 is also less well developed. People are also more aware of the imperative to transform high-profile parts of our socioeconomic systems, such as the energy transition that John mentioned at the beginning, with further work needed to raise awareness of other needs. To explore people's understanding of just how much change is needed, we asked the following question in our survey. So in which, if any of the following areas, do you think scientists agree that major transformational change is needed in the next 10 years to protect and restore nature? And we then presented participants with these 7 areas that you see on the right-hand of the slide, if you're looking at it like I am. So the balance between the use of fossil fuels and renewable energy sources, what we eat and how we produce it, how the economy runs, namely around production and consumption of goods and services, the values that guide how people, businesses and governments behave, the extent of flying and shipping, as well as how these are fueled, inequality, and whether the costs of goods and services should account for the negative externalities caused by production, specifically around damage to nature. So on the next slide, we can see that, as I mentioned earlier, people are more aware of the need to transform these higher profile parts of our socioeconomic systems, while their awareness of the need for change in others was much lower. So for example, 3 in 5 people across the G20 are aware of the need to transform our energy systems, but only 3 in 10 know of the need to internalise the harmful environmental impacts of production. And this indicates more consistent, visible messaging and communication is required about the need for change in these areas. And the pattern is fairly consistent across the individual countries, with people most aware of the need to change the energy systems in their country across the G20, except for France, where people are more aware of the need to change our food system and our diets. We can see this as well when we delve even further into the data from this question. So it's the same question that we asked in the previous slide, but here we're looking at how many areas each respondent selected as an area that they were aware of needing transformation. And roughly 2/3 of people demonstrated a shallower awareness of the need for major social transformation, being aware of the change needed in just 1 to 3 of the areas from a couple of slides ago. And this is particularly the case in some emerging economies. So 77% of people in Mexico selected just 1 to 3 areas. And in Saudi Arabia and Brazil, it was 70% of people who selected those 1 to 3 areas. Around a quarter of people across the G20 indicated awareness of a need for broader transformation, while only 8% recognised the need for wholesale change. And awareness of this need for broader transformation was highest again among some of the groups that Bridget mentioned earlier. So women, older people, families, university graduates and higher earners. And it was also highest amongst those who feel like a global citizen or hold those pro-environmental attitudes, such as concern about the state of nature. So sticking with transformation for a bit longer, let's think about our economies in particular. So for the beady-eyed among you, a couple of slides ago, you'll have seen that 37% of people across the G20 are aware that we need to change how our economies run. And across the G20, people have indicated support for a move towards what you could call well-being economies. So 3/4 support prioritising the well-being of people and planet over profit when thinking about how our economies should run. And this tends to be seen within the majority of individual G20 countries, although we do see a lower level of agreement in Saudi Arabia and Japan. Indonesia, Turkey and Russia, again, countries that Bridget mentioned earlier on as being potentially closer to nature, but also more aware of the need for change, displayed the highest levels of support for these well-being economies. So despite low awareness for the need of change in our economies, people across the G20 are highly supportive of a shift away from traditional economic growth and towards well-being. But how quickly do they think we can get there? So nearly 3/4 again believe that we already have the tools needed to protect nature. However, people are less certain that the benefits of protecting nature, such as environmental and human well-being, would actually be felt in the short term. So 44% feel that we would not see these benefits within the next 3 to 5 years. So that's within a standard election cycle in most Western democracies, certainly. And views on this are similarly mixed across the G20 countries. So 63% of people in India, 54% of people in France and 53% of people in Mexico thought that you would not see these benefits within the next 3 to 5 years. Apart from economic transformation, what other elements do we need to consider when thinking about protecting and restoring nature? So in the survey, we also asked some questions around science-based targets for nature as an initiative that could be used to protect and restore the global commons, similar to the existing science-based targets initiative around businesses' greenhouse gas emissions. And encouragingly, 71% support targets for achieving the protection and restoration of nature being based on science. However, there was a degree of ambivalence around how far this would actually affect people's purchasing decisions. So a third agree that when choosing between products or services, it actually made no difference to them if the business had set targets based on science to protect and restore nature, while a similar proportion disagree and said that it would matter to them. So we believe that at the minute this division is more just because it's a newer issue that people aren't really that aware of and don't have a great level of understanding around at the moment. Related to raising awareness and understanding of key issues, we also explored how far the media were helping or hindering this in relation to nature and climate change. And this was another area where opinion was divided. 2 in 5 feel that the media reporting helps them to understand environmental issues, but closer to half also feel that it leaves them unclear about how to actually take action. And looking at individual G20 countries, people in India are most likely to feel the media leaves them unclear on how to act, with 64% agreeing with this, while China showed the highest support for media reporting. So 74% of people in China agree that the media helps them to understand environmental issues. This indicates that while the media may be communicating about environmental issues and their seriousness to the public, they're not going that extra step to help inform and empower them on what they can do about it. And given the believed true gap that I mentioned earlier, this finding underlines the need for better communication about climate and environmental action from our media as well as our policymakers. I'll not dwell on the next slide for too long, but looking at the top chart, there is strong support for involving communities in decision making around protecting and restoring nature. And alongside this, the bottom chart shows that 64% would also like to see more power given to international organisations such as the UN. There's broad consensus across the G20 countries on both of these points, but notably the US, Canada and Saudi Arabia were much less keen on empowering institutions such as the UN. On the subject of global challenges, unfortunately, over the past 2 years or so, one thing that has affected everybody has been the COVID-19 pandemic. And despite the hardship and loss that it has caused, many people have noted that it could be a golden opportunity for change. So is the COVID-19 pandemic a transformative moment for humanity? Well, among the people that we asked, the short answer is yes, it could be. So 3/4 of people across the G20 agree that the pandemic showed them just how quickly people could change their behaviour when they were presented with an emergency, while 71% see it as creating a unique moment to enable future change. However, these views aren't necessarily shared across the G20 countries, and that's something that we maybe need to bear in mind going forward. So those in Japan, which has struggled with combating the pandemic, particularly in large urban centres like Tokyo, had the lowest levels of agreement across these statements. And in India, which at the time of fieldwork was struggling with a serious wave of the virus, over half, or 56%, felt that COVID was too serious a problem to talk about protecting nature, compared to just 26% across the G20. So before we go into the closing summary, I just want to touch briefly on attitudes that emerged from the data around the idea of being a global citizen, because we've mentioned this term quite a bit throughout the presentation. And an understanding of global connectedness is important for driving the change that we do want to see, as arguably if we have a localised mindset, we are less likely to understand the wider impacts of our actions. So in the survey, 2/3 of people across the G20 supported working together to solve global challenges such as climate change, most notably across the Global South and China. However, when we asked people whether they identified more with their national identity or as a global citizen, views were quite mixed. So 1 in 5 felt like a global citizen, particularly in the Global South again, but 1/3 across the G20 felt closer to their own nationality. Those who feel like global citizens are unsurprisingly more likely to support international cooperation, so it's 81% versus 62% of those who felt more like national citizens. And they're also more worried about the state of nature both now and in the future. Accordingly, they're more likely to be willing to act to protect and restore nature, with 89% wanting to do more, and also to understand the urgency and benefits of doing so. So 4 in 5 of those who felt more like a global citizen agreed that the Earth is close to tipping points due to human activity, while 3 in 4 agreed that the benefits of protecting and restoring nature outweigh the costs. 1/3, so exactly 33% of them, were also aware of the need for more substantial societal change, compared to 28% of everyone across the G20. So people do want to be stewards of the planet that we call home, and it's time that we give them the tools to do so. Concern about the state of nature and willingness to act to protect and restore it is apparent across the G20, and this support and concern should encourage policymakers in particular to deliver the changes necessary. What remains is to tackle the barriers to action that people perceive as stopping them from acting now, and to raise awareness of the immediacy of this issue. There's also an awareness of the consensus on the need for social transformation, but it is somewhat limited in scope. And people need to know more about the extent of social transformation needed over the next 10 years and what this will mean to them and their country. The COVID-19 pandemic is also seen as presenting a key opportunity for change that should be harnessed. And people have now seen what action can be taken in a time of crisis and believe that COVID-19 has created a unique moment to transform societies to better deal with shocks in future. Communication campaigns are also needed to raise awareness, educate and inform about the issues facing nature and the global commons and the need for action and what this action should also be. At the beginning, Bridget had a nice slide showing you which groups had the highest awareness of the need to protect nature and support for action. And when engaging these people about protecting and restoring nature and the need for major social change, we should build upon the established views of some of these groups. Awareness of the need to protect nature and support action is lowest amongst men, older people, people educated up to secondary level, lower earners, those without children, those in rural areas, people who feel more of an affinity with their national identity, and those with sort of less pro-environmental attitudes, as we've referred to it throughout. And these people will be more difficult to engage, so there's a need to encourage awareness and support amongst them and bring them along with us. When we were analysing the survey results, it also became apparent that there are a split in attitudes between the Global South and developed countries, something that has been widely discussed in the run-up to COP26 around how developed nations can support emerging economies with climate mitigation and adaptation. And as such, we think that these regions could perhaps be engaged in different ways. So the Global South already shows broader and stronger acknowledgement of the need to protect and restore nature, as well as support for global cooperation and willingness to act. But the Global South, and in particular India, does have strong concerns about the impacts of action on local economies and of COVID-19. So while there is that base of existing awareness and support, when engaging these regions, messaging will need to acknowledge the need to balance this with other day-to-day concerns. Developed countries, on the other hand, find issues of protecting and restoring nature much more distant. They were less likely to believe we're reaching planetary boundaries, to be willing to protect nature, and to think that the benefits of protecting nature outweigh the costs. There were a few culprits in particular that stood out. So North America, the US and Canada, show lower levels of awareness and engagement with solutions. And in addition, Japan was less likely to see the transformative potential of COVID-19. So in engaging these nations, there is more of a need for messaging, bringing issues and the need to act a bit closer to home. So on that note, thank you all very much for listening to Bridget and myself, and we're happy to open the floor up to discussion and take any questions you might have.
Great. Thank you, Sophie. Thank you, Bridget. We're going to open it out now to Q&A. We might just try, if people speak loud, maybe our speakers are can hear you. If not, I'll translate. So who would like? I've got loads of questions, but I'm going to hold myself back. Who would like to start? Okay, Gerald.
If there was one big surprise for you, what was it?
Could you hear that?
I could. Bridget, did you hear okay? Yep. You're on mute, by the way.
You go first, Sophie.
I think for me, I suppose as somebody that has been more aware of energy and environment issues for a while, it was probably the lack of awareness and engagement in more developed countries that I particularly find surprising, because we have the luxury of having media coverage and access to media stories about the environment and climate 24/7. And yeah, I think that surprised me the most, that even still awareness of the urgency of the issue was still much lower in developed nations compared to the global south?
Mine is quite linked. We do quite a lot of international surveys looking at a number of different issues, and we've been looking at things like climate diplomacy recently. And it was the fact that Canada was actually a bit closer to the US than it was to Europe in its views did surprise me a little bit, because I did expect them to be a little bit closer to Europe. Similarly, Canada just lagging behind was a bit of a surprise, because they are generally perceived around the world as one of kind of the climate heroes rather than a bit of a climate villain, certainly in terms of what they're pushing out. So yeah, the fact that they weren't a little bit more engaged and a little bit more supportive of the type of issues that we were talking about was a bit of a surprise to me.
Could I just ask a follow-up question, perhaps on the back of what Sophie has said, is whether what is being communicated as a lack of awareness within the developed world, could that also be seen as resistance? In other words, it's an awareness but an unwillingness for the types of changes that may be required in the developed world? Or I know you probably didn't ask that directly, but do you think that where we're reading awareness, that could also be, yeah, I'm aware of it, but I'm resisting it, I'm not going to change my lifestyle?
Yeah, certainly I think there is an element of that, and we have seen with sort of country-specific polling research that we've done in the UK more recently, that once people have support for net zero policies, for example, and then once trade-offs are introduced, that support is whittled away once people realise that they can't drive the car in a certain area or buy meat as much as they would otherwise. So there is perhaps an element of that, but certainly within the survey data that we have on this particular study, we don't have the evidence necessarily to back up that hypothesis. I don't know if there's anything you want to add, Bridget?
No, I think it's true. I mean, intuitively, it definitely seems that people in the global north kind of have more lifestyle to lose, maybe. And, you know, sort of feel that the impacts on them and their day-to-day lives are going to be greater. Certainly something I'd like to explore a little bit more going forward, to see, you know, whether people feel that they are more of a loser than other people in their country and other people in other countries as well.
Okay.
Oh, you're on mute, Fiona.
Typical. Yeah, so I could just add just a little from the work that we've done in Northern Ireland, and I think that when we talk to people again and again, they are convinced that in order to change and become more sustainable and use more renewables, that it's going to be hugely expensive, that only rich people can afford to do that. There's a significant proportion who would say that they don't know what to do, which aligns with the work that Sophie and Bridget have done. And the other thought in Northern Ireland is that people think that as an individual, the little bit that they do won't make a difference. So what's the point? So I think that probably aligns well with what the rest of the world think, but that's what we've been hearing again and again in Northern Ireland. Well, I do my recycling, so, you know, but I don't know what else to do.
But there's also, just before I let the next questioner in, there is quite a lot of social science data which tells us that when people recycle more, they can then feel less concern about flying, for example. I mean, it's partly, you could say, you know, people kidding themselves, but actually I think you know, what your survey is showing is that people don't really know the scale or the impact of their behavior in part. So they could genuinely, in good faith, think that, well, I'm an avid recycler, I buy my clothes in second-hand shop, but actually saying that's all wiped out, all that good climate impact by you going for the shopping trip to New York for a hen party. Anyway, we might come back to that. We have another speaker, sorry, questioner.
I was listening to you, I kept thinking about how much social statistics probably influence responses to these questions, but I didn't hear you reflect on that demographic, and I wondered if that we gathered information on and if not, why not? And then equally, where do people get their information? Because that would seem to shape perceptions quite significantly. And you're talking about very disparate countries with very different access to media. So I just wondered whether information came through on those two things, or that's something we need more information on.
Did you get that?
Not
Okay, I'll translate, and if I'm mistranslating, please tell me. So the first issue is that clearly issues of socioeconomic status are important in terms of people's responses, and did you collect any data on that, and if not, why not? And then the other one, given the broad spread of the 19 countries that you surveyed, where do people get their information, given that there's going to be very different sources of media, of education, and so on, and whether or not that, I suppose, disparity in sources of information was taken into account, or was it that you're just asking people and not concerned about where they got their information?
Shall I go first, Sophie, or do you want to? Yeah, okay. So firstly, yes, we did take consistent measures of socioeconomic status. So we asked about working status and income and education, which are the things that we could ask sort of consistently across all of the countries. And the patterns were incredibly consistent across all countries. So it was people with higher levels of education, higher income, people who were in work, who were all more likely to sort of be supportive and aware and sort of show levels of understanding about the issues that we were talking about. So definitely agree that that was an important thing. The other question you asked was about sources of information, and we didn't ask a specific question on that. So the way that we looked at it was more about their kind of perceptions over whether the media gives them the information, in a clear way that will enable them to act. It was notable that China was one of the most kind of positive about the media giving them this information, which, you know, kind of might be a little bit surprising to people in sort of Western democracies who may have slightly different views of Chinese media. But more than that, there's not a lot that we can add, unless you can think of anything else, Sophie.
And I think I'd just add that in the suite of questions we had around COVID-19, the vast majority of people across the G20 also wanted their government to communicate with them about the climate crisis and protecting nature, as they had done with COVID-19. So that's perhaps points in some way towards perhaps a bit of a lack of information, or a perceived lack of reliable, objective, authoritative information, perhaps.
Yeah. Can I go back to something that John was saying previously as well, which was about, you know, people thinking because they're putting their plastic recycling out and taking their fabric bags to the shops that they're fine to hop on a hen-do to New York or something. Something that we are seeing kind of quite a lot at the moment is people telling us that they're doing everything they're told to do. So as such, I kind of feel like people kind of can't also almost be blamed for not doing more, because they're not being given clear and consistent messaging about what that more should be. So we've got quite a lot of people who are kind of trying quite hard to feel their way, definitely wanting to be able to do more and actively asking for more information about what they can personally do, but at the same time not really being given clear guidance. So what was coming out of this survey and other work we've done is, in the run up to the pandemic, I mean, notwithstanding how you feel about how the government communicated, and we could probably have quite a long conversation about that, you know, people were told, you do this, then you do this, and this is the reason why. And I think people took quite a lot of heart from the clarity of the communications that they felt that they had through the pandemic, and want something quite similar. So yeah, there's definitely a gap, and a gap that people desperately want to have filled at the moment.
And I mean, yeah, I'd even add on to that within our Earth Day polling that we did earlier in the year, just 31% of people that we polled across the 28 countries felt that their government had a clear plan about how people and business and government were all going to come together to sort of tackle climate change. And the vast majority felt that that was not being articulated or very clearly put out there and accessible in a way that, as Bridget said, they could know exactly what they need to do and have clear guidance on that.
Are we beating everybody into submission there, John?
Not me. But maybe if that nobody else want to. Yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this was the kind of first survey you did, but you said you were conducting a range of different international surveys in this kind of field. Can you distill from your other surveys, like compared to this one, certain trends that you felt were remarkable, perhaps, compared to the data you collected more recently?
Did you get that?
Well, the question about trends, and if you can compare with any prior survey in similar areas.
So the question is about other surveys that you've done, apart from this one, and can you discern any trends that maybe confirm this survey or that book against some of the trends you found in this one?
Do you mind? Shall I go first, Sophie?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
I mean, I think that one thing which is becoming incredibly clear, because I mean, some of the surveys that we've been running, we've got data series going back sort of 20 plus years. One thing that struck me recently is just the extent to which climate change and the environment have become much more mainstream recently, and much more salient. So in previous years, climate change would kind of pop up as something of interest and importance to people if there was extreme weather events or if there was a natural disaster somewhere in the world, but then levels of interest and awareness would pop down again pretty quickly. Whereas really since kind of late 2018, early 2019, levels of awareness and interest have been building. It's not been only upwards, it's been, kind of a bit up and down, but the direction of travel has definitely been upwards. And it's moved from something which was perceived as very much a young people, urban, left-leaning issue to something which is much more mainstream now. So there are far fewer differences by age or by kind of political party support than there were previously. So I think one of the big things that we've learned, and it's a global thing, is that climate change is much more salient and much more mainstream an issue to talk about than it was previously.
That perfectly captures my thoughts as well, Bridget. I don't have too much more to add to that.
Could I just make a general comment, which I find fascinating about your survey, is that quite a lot of, well, certainly my research is on the limits of technologically decoupling growth. So I'm particularly interested, obviously, in the support for a well-being economy going beyond economic growth. Now, I don't think that's percolated into our leaders and policymakers. They're still kind of addicted to GDP economic growth as the only policy. But the point I'm making is that we have no credible empirical evidence of being able to absolutely decouple a growing economy from climate, resource and pollution impacts. And then what this means is we're going to have to start addressing consumption. And that's where your survey comes in. And therefore, it is a bit worrying to see that the levels of changing consumption, say, particularly for rich Western countries, is so poorly understood. And if I was to be so bold as to maybe advise you on one of your next surveys, is to start exploring the possibility of shifting from private to public consumption as a strategy. So what I mean by that is that, because I'm very fond of alliteration, is that we need to start putting more squarely on the agenda in terms of changes of consumption. It's around recomposing. It's not about reducing consumption. We're simply going to find a different delivery mechanism and largely around public and sharing types of arrangements. So for me, the alliteration is libraries, laundromats and light rail. In other words, it's about communicating to citizens that we will still be able to travel. You'll still be able to get books and DVDs and so, although I'm showing my age now, who has a DVD. But it is about saying that this narrative of sacrifice, I think, is a very individualized response rather than seeing it as actually we can meet our needs, but perhaps it's going to be in a much more, what I would call socialized consumption. I mean, as Sophie would know, I'm an old socialist at heart, and in fact, I can read in your survey quite a lot of support for some of my own ideological preferences. But even apart from that, it does seem to me that just purely technically from a scientific point of view, it serves us much better to have people in public transportation, not private cars, to have much more libraries than everybody trying to go and buy a book off Amazon and so on. And so I do think that the research you've identified in terms of how do we narrate that changes in consumption, that people can have good lives, they're going to get their needs met, but maybe it's no longer in those privatized individual forms of consumption. So that's more of a mansplaining. Apologies, I've just been mansplained yesterday on a very well-known BBC radio program here, so it's on my mind. But it's just to reiterate how I find it fascinating, your research, but suggest maybe opening up people's minds that it's not a sacrifice. What we're talking about is a recomposition of our consumption, the delivery mechanisms, but maybe it is more in that direction, as I say, just more welfare state, more socialized forms of consumption, not individualized. I'm not saying Ipsos MORI are going to be supporting eco-socialism now, don't be worrying.
The one sort of quite interesting thing that has come out of other work that we've done, not from this particular survey, and this is UK only, is that the pandemic has caused the British public in particular to think about the kind of almost consumption for fun. So we did quite a lot of work for BAYS, which was published and taken down, but is due to be published again this week, about sort of pro-net zero behaviours that people took up through the pandemic. And one of those was kind of consumption for fun. And a lot of people, obviously, because they weren't going on day trips or, just kind of shopping for fun, greatly reduced the amount of consumption that they were reporting to us because of the pandemic. And there was a broad realization that actually that was a good thing. And I think it was more than 8 in 10 of those who had reduced their consumption through the pandemic said that they wanted to continue to do so. Now, whether they will continue to do so is another matter, but it's another one of those cases where there was a kind of change in behaviour which was brought about not so much by a nudge but by an almighty shove led from the pandemic, which may have helped bring people to a realisation that they don't have to continue acting in that way. I don't know if that kind of gets near the points that you were talking about, but there may be some changes to patterns of consumption associated with the pandemic going forward.
And we did see that actually a bit with the Earth Day polling as well. We asked a question specifically about some of the behaviour changes that may have happened as a result of the pandemic. And a lot of people said that they were going to continue or to even more so buy things like secondhand clothing or being more mindful of when they go shopping, not just doing it as a pastime to go dander around Victoria Square on a Saturday morning, but to sort of think about when they actually need to buy or consume and make more mindful decisions around that. So we do see that attitudes are shifting a little bit more towards that path, as Bridget has highlighted with the UK specific polling, or research rather, for BAYS.
But you have a fascinating case study here in Northern Ireland where we've all been given £100 to go out and spend in the high street, and I hope you're right in terms of changes in patterns of consumption. I mean, there was a lot of recognition during the pandemic of people reconnecting with green spaces, being grateful for the fact that they maybe had access to the countryside or, a park. I mean, often, you know, think what must it have been like if you were a single mum in a high-rise block in London during the worst parts of the lockdown and so on. So I think there has been a reappraisal, but I suppose I've got a concern about how permanent that is when we already see the, you know, promotion now of, you know, Christmas, high street shopping vouchers, you know, we're open for, anyway, I won't bore you all. Any other questions or comments? Could I ask then? It's me just hogging everything. See what you get when you don't speak. You listen to me. Do you think, you know, shifting just from the survey results, but more in terms of your experience in terms of public communications, that, and it's an issue you had raised, Bridget, and actually it's something that I was thinking about, particularly in the early parts of the pandemic, about using the pandemic experience and the frames, the communication frames that we had around the pandemic as a read over into the climate and ecological issue. Of course, I'm conscious of the fact that we spent most time really, it's always climate that seems to get, and energy therefore as a result gets the lion's share, and issues of ecological biodiversity loss often get lost. But whether, you know, using, for example, you know, remember that I thought it was a brilliant communication strategy, which didn't last for the whole of the public relations by government, of bending the curve down, of flattening the curve.
Yeah.
So, you know, we all understood that we were doing all these things, socially distancing, staying at home, to stop the pandemic. We couldn't, in a way, stop. It was to prevent the peak of it from overwhelming healthcare system. I thought it was a very effective one. Whereas what we need to be doing, I think it was actually you said it, Bridget, we need to start bending the curve down. Imagine if we were to get every week or every month the Prime Minister with the Chief Scientific Officer, you know, telling us about Britain's path in terms of, oh, this week we brought down greenhouse gas by this amount or this sector. Because I thought there was something quite effective about that way in which our political leaders were standing beside epidemiologists, the medical experts. And I think that's what people found trustworthy, because politicians, and I speak as a recovering one myself, they aren't the most trustworthy of creatures in the public's mind, but actually science does still, you know, have that sense. So whether, you know, in terms of even a communication technique, that idea of bending the curve down, and the curve, of course, being greenhouse gas emissions, whether you would suggest, again, from a communications point of view, that's something that we should definitely consider. So don't talk about tons of carbon, or don't be talking about, you know, the IPCC, you know, all these issues often don't land with people. Say, listen, here's the problem. We've got this rising, you know, carbon dioxide, greenhouse gas emissions, and our job is to bend that curve down. So I just wonder if you any thoughts on that.
There's a definite need for feedback, I think, is the core thing, and that was very effective feedback in that people could see from the behaviour that curve was being bent down. So I think we've kind of been banging on about a lack of feedback on climate action for the public for a good couple of years now, in saying that people just aren't being told how effective or not their actions are, and sort of very localised feedback on, you know, how much is being recycled in the area, which then drives social norming, and we can start to move into kind of broader behavioural theory to get people to change their behaviours. Feedback is just super important. I think the other thing is language, because you need to look at the reasons why people are making changes and the sort of hooks which are quite effective to use for them. So going back to the behaviour change that we saw through the pandemic that we measured for Bayes, when we asked people why they had done that, really the main reasons that always came out were, it's better for my family's health and well-being. It saves us money because a lot of people were under a kind of financial pinch at the time. The third reason was then it's because of lockdown, and then climate change came forth. So even though that was a kind of positive outcome from it, it wasn't necessarily a motivation. And we need to think about the framing of some of the behaviour change that we're asking people about, and how we can frame it positively from the point of view of their lives and their families' personal sort of circumstances, as well as from a climate change point of view. So the framing is really, really important.
Yeah, another question.
Transmitter. I go back to the first question with what your surprise was in terms of like the contrast between developing or in developing countries and the West that you highlighted. I think since Paris, there has been like this kind of narrative that you have to bring in developing countries into this debate and convince them that there is this big global problem. Your data highlight now that these countries are much more aware of these problems, and in fact, the West is the laggard. Is there something to change the entire narrative around this debate a bit and push much more emphasis on enlightened circles in the West, that they basically aren't the enlightened ones and really have to do much more? That's the first question, and perhaps relatedly, I was interested, since you said you conducted an online survey, how have you ensured representativeness in terms of socioeconomic status, let's say in Indonesia, India, with very large rural populations, just from an interest perspective?
Oh, okay. Assuming you probably didn't catch all of that, you can tell the university is still not set up for hybrid events. But anyway, so the two questions. The second one was, given it was an online survey, what mitigations did you put in to ensure then representativeness, particularly given that some countries, and the examples given of Indonesia perhaps may not have as a good provision in terms of internet and so on. And the first question then was that, more of a comment in a way, and with which I would agree, is that often the debate, particularly since Paris, the big Paris Agreement of 6 years ago, was that, oh, we need to bring the developing world in with us, China, India, and so on, where actually your survey seems to show that it's actually the global south is leading. They're already there. They're already recognizing the severity, and they're much more even globally a sense of citizenship. So what would your reaction to that be in terms of changing like the media almost, or the common sense narrative of, somehow it's the West that needs enlightening. It's the West that needs to catch up, or the global North, because it's the global South are actually already ahead in terms of the global reach and the recognizing the severity, and that we are the laggards. It's us in the global North.
I mean, there is definitely sort of strong recognition. I'm speaking from the UK now, just because that's the thing that we've done most recently. That there should be a model of polluting countries should pay more to make things better. There's also fairly strong support in the UK. I think it's about 6 in 10 are now supporting kind of aid to developing countries to help them to get over some of the climate challenges that they're facing, not least because of pollution being pushed out by Western economies. Whether that means that the people of the UK think we can throw money at the situation and buy our way out of, where we are, I'm not entirely sure, and it's something we certainly like to dig down deeper. But I think that, yeah, it's true that we need to start looking at ourselves a little bit more and stop pushing things away. We are actually seeing a bit less of people, the kind of what about China messages that we've heard so much over recent years. But yeah, I'm completely with you that Western economies do need to catch up on taking personal responsibility and individual behaviour change to help to push things in those economies. Have you got anything else you wanted to add?
No, I was just going to jump in on the methodological point. So we did weight the data to age, gender, region, and working status was the other one, Bridget. But yeah, we do recognise that in perhaps Indonesia and India and Turkey are some of the other ones where we do have an awareness that the sample tends to be skewed towards more urban people and more educated people. So that is why we have that slightly more complex weighting scheme on those results, to try and avoid some of those skews coming through into the data.
Yeah, and in other times, we would potentially have done some of the fieldwork face-to-face rather than online. But obviously we were conducting it through a global pandemic when it's not good sending people into other people's houses. So we were having to work within the global context of fieldwork at the same time.
Any final questions? Yes, Cheryl, yeah.
I'll throw a little anecdote about a visit to Indonesia that I made. Forgive me for the flex. I was visiting a missionary couple in Indonesia, stayed with them, and their daughter had been to school. She was about 7 years old, and she came home with her spellings, and I was to do her spellings, which were in English. And they were words like sustainable development. There were real words about climate and ecology and global awareness.
Right.
And I think that my experience with the Global South is that they're very much more switched on. Obviously, the poorest people, and the conversation that we had with students in the summer indicated that in places where there are just difficulties surviving, people can't focus on changing the climate. But they are aware that it's an issue.
Yeah.
To play devil's advocate, you could argue that it's much more in the global South's interest to be aware and to make sure that their people know, because it's a nice way to blame the global North for any ecological problems that they're facing, any economic problems that they're facing. Whereas in the global North, our governments want to pretend that they want to tell us, and the economic powerhouses of our industries want us to not ask for too much change. So it's not in their interest to foster a much more radical awareness of the changes that need to happen.
Keep calm and carry on, I think, is the watchword of our business and political leaders. In fact, related to what Cheryl has said, maybe if no one else wants to come in, I've just got one final observation or question, is that I would imagine if you, because I noticed what you were saying about Canada being closer to Berlin, or sorry, both closer to Boston and Berlin in terms of its attitudes to some of the issues you were asking. I wonder now, after the experience of the heat dome in Canada and parts of North America, or the devastating floods in Germany and so on, or the fact that God, as my mother would say, in Ireland and Britain, for the very first time in July this year, we had the issuing of our very first amber heat warnings. In other words, I wonder if did you take into account or ask a question of people who responded to your survey, had they experienced direct impacts of the planetary crisis? Because obviously that's an issue that will definitely influence your responses to some of the questions that you asked. So do you have any sense that I think these extreme weather events that even we in the global North are experiencing are going to become much more frequent? But did you ask that question of people's experiences directly of the climate or ecological collapse that's already happening?
We didn't, and I don't remember it ever being asked on a survey, so I'm going to note that down on my interesting things we're going to pop on the next one that we can. Yeah, just to see if people are now more aware of it and are linking it direct to climate change, but also their own personal experience. I mean, fieldwork is always conducted at a particular, it's a snapshot of what's happening in people's lives at that particular point in time. And I'm sure that if we did this now, we'd get very different results. Well, not very, but we'd certainly get different results to the ones we got in April and May, for just the reasons that you're talking about, John. Yeah.
Well, listen, folks. Oh, sorry, Sophie, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, even with the Earth Day data, that fieldwork was a month or two prior to the fieldwork for this study. And you know, we'd had wildfires in California and all sorts of extreme weather events in America and Australia in particular, and you did see, you know, there was a notable difference between some of the US and Australia data, even between the two studies. Again, given that point of a snapshot in time.
Yeah, but I'll send you something else to have a look at, John, because when we look at our UK data, looking at kind of, we call it the Issues Index, which is awareness of different impacts in the UK at a given time. You used to be able to plot extreme weather events just by looking at it. You didn't even have to kind of go back to the internet and check the dates of the, you know, the big kind of windstorms or heat waves or anything like that, but it is less of an issue now. So it is driving things less than it used to in the past, because people are becoming a bit more used to them in terms of just seeing them more and more in the news around the world. So it will have an impact, but possibly less than it did kind of 10 years ago or so.
No, I think you're right, and it's kind of sad that some research that I've been involved in shows that I think almost 80% of all local councils in the UK have declared climate and ecological emergencies. I mean, people forget the UK Parliament declared an emergency in May 2019, the Northern Ireland Assembly in February last year. But despite that kind of high-level rhetorical, you know, declaration of an emergency, I think the experience directly of climate-related extreme weather events will actually do more to enhance people's awareness and so on. But even that statistic I've just given you, almost 80%, most people don't even know that the British Parliament declared an emergency, because unlike the pandemic, that's what a real emergency looks like. You know, so it kind of cheapens that kind of language if the Parliament declares an emergency and then nothing happens. Whereas the experience directly of extreme weather events is certainly going to be a focusing experience in terms of your relation to these, which is really, really sad, because it almost means that what we're going to have to wait on almost is not governments, you know, moving on this and bringing our people with us, but our people having to suffer, and then action will follow. I mean, I hope I'm completely wrong, but that seems to be what's happening at the moment. It's that direct experience of these, that's what changes people's consciousness and then moving. And when our governments declare an emergency, you know, they're not taking it seriously, and therefore we don't have to. So it's that leadership that's probably missing at the moment. But maybe I could be wrong. The blonde bomber that is known as Boris Johnson may pull it out of the bag in COP26. We can only live in hope. But can I thank Bridget and Sophie and Fiona for your time tonight? That's been actually quite hopeful in a way, because often I'm a very happy, energetic person, but I think the area I've chosen means that I'm not depressed, but I may be in danger of being a carrier. I mean, there's some, you know, elements of, it shows there's still a lot of work to be done, but particularly you know, that issue that the global south is already demonstrating leadership and awareness. That maybe a bit like, you remember that film, The Day After Tomorrow, one of the many Hollywood, you know, climate change films, where in the end, it's the American government in exile who is taken in by Costa Rica, and it's kind of like reversing the usual, you know, north-south relations on this issue. That's part of what I've taken from your presentation and our discussion tonight. But can I ask you all to thank our guests? So thank you all, and particularly Sophie, thank you for the connection. You know, maybe we can do more of these, because I do feel strongly that in the academy we should be hosting, you know, the communication around these issues a lot more, because this is more than just an academic issue. I mean, it's an existential, whole of society approach that we're going to need. So listen, thank you for your valuable work and your service, and hopefully we might even see each other in person at some point. Listen, take care now. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.